Welcome, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the course African History Through the Lens of Economics, which is hosted by the London Business School Wheeler Institute for Business and Development. My name is Nathan Nunn. I'm a professor of economics. Today we have a great lecture and followed by a discussion. It'll actually be the last in our series for this semester. So I'm very excited about the ability to talk to our speakers today, who I'll introduce now. Our moderator for today is Shope Ogunrombi, who is a graduate from the University of Cape Town. She is a Gary Lubner Scholar and is currently an MBA student at the London Business School. She'll moderate our session and collect questions from everybody who's listening. So as always, please ask any questions and provide any comments in the Q&A function within Zoom. And our speaker today will be Joseph Henrich. He's the professor and chair at the Department of Human and Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. He'll talk more about his research, but he's particularly well known for two recent books that he's published. One is called The Secret of Our Success, and the second is The Weirdest People in the World. So as you'll come to understand from his presentation, he's a very multidisciplinary individual. He's contributed to economics, evolutionary anthropology, and psychology, and has had big impacts in the field. He's somebody whose research I've been following since I was in graduate school 25 years ago. And so I'm very excited to hear what he has to say today. So we'll turn the floor over to Joe Henrich, where he'll have a short presentation, and then we'll follow that by some questions from myself, but also from Shope, who will take questions from the audience. So without further ado, Joe.
Can you hear me, Nathan?
Yep, I can hear you, and the slides are great. Thanks.
All right, thanks. Well, great to be with everyone today, even if only virtually. So what I'd like to do is talk about the field of cultural evolution. And I have these two relatively recent books where the first one, The Secret of Our Success, I try to develop some ideas that have been developing at the interstices between anthropology, economics, and psychology that really make an effort to try to understand humans as a cultural species, recognizing that more than any other species in the world, I'm from evolutionary biology, humans are reliant on learning from other people. And this has deep effects on our behavior. We acquire preferences and motivations and ways of thinking about the world. And so The Secret of Our Success is an effort to sort of lay out a framework for thinking about culture and humans as a species. And then The Weirdest People in the World is kind of an application of that, to understand some of the global variation we see in psychology and other kinds of outcomes. Now, I know this is a seminar focused on economic growth. If I was going to talk about the book, The Weirdest People in the World, I would probably start by characterizing a lot of the psychological variation we see around the globe. So differences across countries and regions and other kinds of population divisions and individualism, conformity, inclinations towards analytic thinking, inclinations to cooperate with strangers or to trust people you don't know or you've met for the first time. But since this is an economics-oriented group, I'm going to start with economic growth. So what's the variation in economic growth? How do we understand the changes in this over time? So thinking about it from an evolutionary approach. Now, economists have traditionally done a lot of work focusing on these areas. So the role of formal institutions, so thinking about the work of Jim Robinson and Daron Acemoglu and lots of others. The importance of trade, exchange, and specialization, going all the way back to the moral philosopher Adam Smith, and actually before, and of course, things like the role of innovation, the free lunch that we seem to be able to get by generating new technological innovations. Here I'm a big fan of the work of Joel Mokyr, the economic historian. But the question I like to ask is, underneath those things, so the ability of populations to generate innovations, the well-functioning of certain kinds of formal institutions, the ability of strangers to come together and exchange relatively inexpensively is going to be affected by culture. So people's psychology, how they think about the world, who they trust, who they cooperate with, the social norms they have, what are their responsibilities and obligations, what are they supposed to do, and how they're structured by informal institutions as opposed to, the constitutions and democracies and government organizations that are sort of big institutions. I'm thinking here about the small institutions like marriage systems, things like that. All right, so to really get into this, I need to tell you a little bit about what culture is. And it's often fuzzy, right? The social sciences is notoriously fuzzy about what it means, what culture actually means. It uses this catch-all and stuff, but we can begin to get very specific about it. Culture is what people acquire when they learn from other people. And like I said, compared to other animals, humans are heavily reliant. So babies come into the world and they start acquiring things from the people around them. In fact, babies are actually already acquiring mom's dialect, their linguistic dialect, while still in the womb. So they come out already having certain dialect preferences. People are adopting beliefs, practices, ways of thinking, aspirations, standards for themselves, and all kinds of other things, practices and notions of right and wrong. And this is really information stored in people's brains that got there via social learning. So we don't need to be dualistic about it and think there's culture in biology. When we learn stuff, our brains change physically, and that's how that information is stored. So it's a non-genetic biological change that you get when you acquire culture. And we can now see this. So we have the tools of neuroscience, MRIs, those kinds of things, and we can see what happens when people learn stuff and how this leads to differences across societies. And then we can think about how children and adults learn over their lifetime, and then think about them interacting and learning from others. And we have models of cultural evolution. We can mathematize this, study them systematically, make predictions. So all the kind of good stuff that economists like. And to recognize that this is happening unconsciously all the time. So it's not that people say, oh, I'm going to learn that. Sometimes, of course, they do. But lots of times they're just being affected, unconsciously absorbing the judgments and practices and evaluations from those around them without realizing it. There's plenty of research. Now, the approach that I put forth in The Secret of Our Success is very much an evolutionary approach. So rather than just saying people learn from each other, we can build a first principles foundation for understanding when people should learn from others, who they should pay attention to, what kinds of information they should get, and how they should integrate information from different people. So we take the logic of natural selection and ask, how should our minds have been designed by natural selection, operating over hundreds of thousands of years? We're pretty sure it's been at least that long. To be shaped to allow us to acquire this information. And then we can go out into the world and test it in a variety of ways. And there's an entire literature in developmental psychology that has grown up showing how adaptively kids learn from others, not just learning from mom and dad, but learning from peers and other kinds of competent individuals. Now, we're also going to want to take into account that we're a primate, we're an ape, and we have lots of aspects of our psychology that shape our culture and lives that don't have to do with just the learning, but the fact that we have certain amount of human nature that shapes culture, which I'll say more about in a little bit. And we can build formal models. So we don't have to assume this stuff or guess. We can build a rigorous model that predicts what we should see, and then we can test it. Now, the next step is to build a cultural evolutionary model. Given what we know about human learning, we can then ask questions: when do you get rapid adaptation, complex tools, certain kinds of rituals or other kinds of practices? You get a theory about what a social norm is. It's a behavior for which you also transmit the standards for judging others. And that locks the things up. That causes everyone to need to behave in a particular way. And then that shapes our minds. And of course, diverse languages can be modeled this way. These are cultural products. But what's become increasingly clear over the last 20 years is when people grow up in these culturally constructed worlds with the different languages they speak and the different institutions, it then affects their cognition in ways that affects what they pay attention to, what they can remember, how they approach problems, the kinds of reasoning they do, and lots of other things. So these are just a few examples: visual processing, self-regulation, pro-social motivations towards strangers, how we think about numbers, spatial cognition, all have been shown to be affected by the cultural milieu in which kids grow up. And then, of course, the secret of our success is really about this long-term process, the gene-culture coevolution. But for our purposes and for understanding lots of economic and other kinds of diversity around the world, we can just focus on the cultural evolutionary portion, how people learn from other and how that affects things over generations. And I'm going to be zooming in specifically today on a specific set of social norms and institutions. Now, one thing, now I'll point to the fact that we already know there's lots of global psychological variation. So I mentioned some of these. So this is just a quick look at a few of them. In-group, out-group trust varies. So this is people's inclination to trust strangers, people they meet for the first time, versus members of their family, their neighbors, people like that. And there's just a lot of variation in this. And you'll see there's actually a lot of Africa we don't know very much about. We don't have data on this from that. Individualism, of course, varies around the world. Australia, the US, and Britain are the most individualistic places in the world, but there's the full gamut of variation around that. And something like moral universalism. So how much is there a separation between your friends and family and more distant folks? And that also varies. So that's just 3 maps of psychological variation. And the idea is that this has outcomes for how innovative groups are, how well certain institutions function. You need a fit between psychology and institution. And how readily people are to engage in entrepreneurial activities, hire strangers, things like that. So filling this in, I pointed to this economic growth question and these usual things that economists point to that are important, but I want to look at the cultural psychology. So thinking about things like individualism, impersonal trust, and these others, and think about how they affect that. But then what I really want is a theory about where that cultural psychology comes from. And one theory that my colleagues and I have been working on now is the idea that kinship norms, the norms that organize marriage and the family, have an impact on people's psychology that then affects the kinds of institutions and their likelihood of innovating and whatnot. Okay, so the first question, I think a good way to get into this is to ask the question, if we have a measure of economic growth, can we link it to something about kinship norms? Because all that intermediate stuff kind of doesn't matter unless we can go from one side of this plot to the other side. Now, I want to say a little bit more about kinship norms before I address that question. So if we look at the broad breadth of human history, it's fairly clear that the earliest and most primordial of human institutions is the family. So we have certain innate anchors. So I mentioned the importance of things besides what we learn. So like other animals and including other primates, we have an inclination to help blood relatives. This seems to have nothing to do with culture. Mothers everywhere love their children. They don't need to learn to love their children. Just one obvious example. But what culture does is it extends this. So in lots of places, there's a few different people you call mom. You might call your genetic mother's sister mom. Or you might call her little mom if she's younger, or big mom, with the appropriate translation. And then this gets extended into networks. So lots of people will call what English speakers would call cousins, they call them brothers and sisters. They use the brother and sister term, just to give some examples. So that's one way that culture operates. The other is marriage. Obviously, marriage is cultural. There's lots of variation across societies in the roles and responsibilities of husbands and wives, about the number of wives you can have, about who exchanges money and which way money flows at the marriage. But this is all built on a pair bonding instinct. There's a reason why marriage is so recurrent, is that like gorillas, humans form long-term pair bonds for the purposes of childbirth. And then finally, like other primates, we have to avoid having sex with close relatives. So just like other primates, we avoid sex with siblings. That's why you have a disgust reaction at the thought of sex with your sibling. But culture can harness that and extend it to other relatives. And anthropologists call this incest taboos. And this rewires the social network in ways that have impacts on our psychology and our social opportunities and other kinds of things. So it structures human social networks. Now, one of the idea that anthropologists have developed and that has now become increasingly prominent, the economist Bernanke develops a version of this in a recent paper, is the notion of kinship intensity. So if you look across human societies, it looks like as we went from relatively small-scale hunter bands to increasingly complex societies and eventually pre-modern states, the kinship practices got more intense in the sense that they built tighter groups that were more bound together, probably for the purposes of defending territory, because previously people were mobile. And they created things like clans where people are related through their fathers, for example, or through their mothers, or kindreds, some societies have done. Cousin marriage emerged and became popular for creating alliances and links among families that endure through time. Polygyny spread. Hunter-gatherers have light polygyny. And that creates lots of half siblings and other kinds of relatives. Postmarital residence rules, where you always live with the husband's family or the mother's family, things like that. And there's lots of other of these, but they seem to be geared towards doing a similar thing, even when you see interesting variation, building up kinship intensity. And one of the things I point out to my colleagues who have been raised largely in Western societies is that what they think of as the normal family is not the normal family. These families are weird. So weird is an acronym that stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And it's meant as a consciousness raising device because so much research is done specifically in the US, but more generally in Western societies. Researchers sometimes make the mistake, often make the mistake, that what they encounter in their daily lives is how humans are. And of course, as an anthropologist, I was immunized against this mistake early. But in other disciplines, you don't have that. So just as a way of persuading them, I will point out that these common kinship traits, so tracing descent through mom and dad, not marrying your cousins, marrying only one spouse at a time, having a nuclear family as opposed to an extended family, or living independent of everyone, are actually rare when you look at the anthropological database. In this case, this is the Ethnographic Atlas. So you can see that most societies don't have bilateral descent. They track primarily through one mom or dad, or some other more complicated thing. Most societies do have cousin marriage, so people marry their cousins. Most societies have traditionally been polygynous, even though monogamous marriage has been spreading with the spread of Western institutions. Nuclear family, same story, and neolocal residence. If we put all this together, we find very few societies have these societies. So this is over half of societies have none of these traits, and then only a very small sliver has all five. And these were societies that are basically Christianized early by European populations as they spread, or their European populations. And the family is the most obvious place to start if you want to think about an institution that shapes our minds, because it's the first institutions children encounter when they enter the world. They're immediately born into a family and begin learning about how one navigates a world structured by a particular kinship system and a particular set of relatives. Just to give you a sense of the difference here, in societies with intensive kinship, you're given a bunch of relationships at birth, and there's a lot of pressure to conform to the roles and responsibilities associated with your position in that kinship system. At the other end, you're born into a little monogamous nuclear family with hardly any relatives, and you have to go out into the marketplace of relationships and pitch yourself. What is it about you that I should have want to have an ongoing relationship with you as a business partner, a friend, or a mate, a spouse? So we cultivate dispositional attributes: trustworthy, honest, friendly, smart, those kinds of things. If you're in the intensive world, you connect new connections through your networks. The more you're going to trust someone more if you're connected to them through multiple ties. In the weak kinship world, there's not very many ties of these enduring, lifelong kind. So you need to focus on personal attributes: trustworthy. Trust is based on embeddedness in the intensive world. It's based on dispositions in the mobile world. This is a world of shame, where you're trying not to have others think bad of you, to be ashamed of you. Whereas this is a world of guilt, where you're trying to live up to your own personal standards, which may or may not be societal standards. And then finally, you derive your identity from your relationships and your enduring groups, as opposed to this cultivated self. So that's just some of the ways in which this can shape how people think, which then affects things downstream. Now, what my colleagues and I did is we went to this ethnographic atlas, this anthropological database, and using some inferential ways, some of which were developed by Professor Nunn, we're able to make inferences about the kinship intensity of societies around the world. So you can see this is with some co-authors: Duman Barani Ra, Jonathan Beauchamp, and Jonathan Schultz. And so this gives you a measure of the kinship intensity around the globe, and you can see the red is high. And the low would be blue. You can see that the US is mostly blue, but in some places, it's not there. You can go to Bolivia. Actually, that's the group called the Mapuche in Chile. The Middle East has a lot of red, and of course, Africa has a lot of red. So you can immediately see there's a difference in the intensity of kinship across societies. All right. And then there's the question of how to measure economic prosperity. So here we took an idea that's been developed by economists, including Professor Mikolopoulos, for using satellite night imagery to measure economic prosperity. So this is, we have these images of the Earth at night. Some places are lit up at night, some places aren't. There's good reason to think that that's closely correlated with economic prosperity in those places. And that's what this plot shows. So the places that are red are places that are lit up at night. And the places that are more bluish have fewer lights. And lots of checks here. It does seem to be a pretty good measure of economic prosperity. And our question is simply, can we link this kinship intensity to this economic prosperity in a way that suggests that, or at least eliminates other possible causal relationships besides the actual structure of the family playing a role. So I'm not going to go into the details, but I will show you this one plot here. In places with more cousin marriage, that's easy to understand. You see lower rates of economic prosperity. So here we're using GDP and not the light luminosity, but I can show you the light luminosity as well. It would tell the same story. And we can use the larger kinship measure, the kinship intensity measure that has clans and polygyny and cousin marriage and all this kind of different stuff in it to show the same thing. So where you have strong, large families, we see less economic prosperity. And the argument is that there's all kinds of social constraints and requirements and whatnot that affect people's behavior, as well as how they think about the world, how much do they trust strangers, which ultimately cashes out in these differences. When we do this, we only compare groups living within the same country. So none of this is about national level things. Health, safety, healthcare, national level corruption is not going to matter. It's just the local level. And we can hold things like geography constant. We get this basic relationship. Now, one of the things that we're trying to figure out if there's a real link here that seems robust, and to all of our basic checks, trying to add all kinds of other variables, this seems to hold. But one of the things we did was we have all these different groups that have different intensities of kinship, ethno-linguistic groups all over the world. And we can just look at the ones within a country, and we can look at the borders where they meet up. And we look to see if when we travel from a group with low kinship intensity to a group with high kinship intensity, and we cross that border between those groups, do we see the expected increase or decrease in light luminosity in this case? And what this plot shows is that indeed, when we do go from a low kinship intensity group to a high kinship intensity group, we see a drop at the border, which is what we'd expect. And it becomes more difficult to argue that this is not the kind of causal relationship we think is underpinning this. There remain concerns, but okay. So now let me dig in a bit more. So we think that makes a good case that there is this relationship between kinship intensity and economic growth. And I mentioned that it probably runs through both how people think about the world and the obligations and requirements of the social worlds they have to navigate that then ultimately affects economic growth. But where do these come from? Well, there's a number of different lines of research out there that try to figure this out. The one I've been really interested in is religions, because different religions prescribe different kinds of things for the family. Something that most people will be familiar with is that, Christianity only allows you to have one wife at a time, if you're a male, and whereas Islam allows you to have up to 4. Of course, back into history, the elites had hundreds of wives, so 4 is a huge constraint, and 1, of course, is an extreme constraint. Okay, so one of the puzzling things here is, with the emergence of rapid economic growth in Europe after about 1750, there's a question: why did that occur? And a lot of people think the unusually small monogamous nuclear families in Europe came about as a consequence of economic growth. Not the case. We have good evidence that it precedes any kind of economic takeoff. And in fact, it goes back to the expansion of the Roman Catholic Church throughout Europe. This is an argument that's made by a number of historians. We have additional data to support it. And just to give you a sense, obviously you're all English speakers because you're listening to me. If you think about the English word sister-in-law, what's the in-law part? Well, the in-law part means in canon law. And English changes from using more traditional kinship terminology of the kind you'd find in lots of languages to having this in-law added to it. When the church tried to eliminate levirate marriage and sororal marriages, which is where when your husband dies, you marry his brother. Very common across societies, eliminated from Europe beginning around the 5th century. The Catholic Church also eliminates cousin marriage, basically all cousin marriage out to a pretty far degree in Europe in the early Middle Ages, so 800 or so. You may be familiar with a Christian ceremony where the priest or preacher says something like this. If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot be lawfully joined together in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. This is actually a piece of incest inquest. In the Carolingian Empire, it was a final check to make sure that cousins weren't getting married. So the church outlaws up to 6 cousins, imposing incest taboos, bans polygyny, bans sex slaves, ends arranged marriage. Brides must say, I do. Usually brides don't get to say anything in anthropological studies of marriage, but the church required the bride to say something to make sure it wasn't a forced marriage. And the church also discourages corporate ownership of land, requiring individual ownership. And this was first really developed by this anthropologist, Jack Goody, that's since picked up by other historians. So in European history, due to this kind of quirky set of beliefs in the Catholic Church, Europeans end up with small families. If this theory is true, we should be able to connect these medieval church policies to kinship institutions in Europe and connect that to these aspects of psychology, which we think affect economic outcomes. We should also be able to go like this. So just to show you one composite set of plots, if you look at the number of years that different populations around the world have been under the church, we can see that there's lower cousin marriage rates depending on more centuries under the church. So that's 1,000 years of possible church time. Now, if we look at the upper right plot, we can see that places with higher rates of cousin marriage have a less individualistic and less impersonal psychology. So less trust in strangers and less focus on the self as opposed to the collective, the local collective. And then finally, we have the link here between the church and weird psychology, so individualism, impersonal prosociality. More centuries under the medieval church, greater individualism, less conformity, more analytic thinking, and more impersonal prosociality, so trust in strangers and whatnot. You can see it's strongest in the Western church, but we also get effects for the Eastern church, which makes sense in historical perspective because they had a kind of light version of these marriage and family shaping policies. Here's a look at the individualism plot. I could show you all the plots. They all tell the same story. So greater kinship intensity, whether you measure it using our index or you measure it using cousin marriage, you see less individualism. This even holds if you hold people's religiosity and religious denomination constant. So it's not, we're not picking up religion stuff. This seems to be about the details of the family. And we can include lots of other things people might worry about. And this is the church. So more centuries under the church, greater individualism. Strong effect for the Western church, weaker, but still visible effect for the Eastern church. Same thing about Asch conformity. So this is a measure of how much people want to go along with their peers, even when they probably really know what the real judgment is. So this is a perceptual judgment, and I won't go into details, but in places with high kinship intensity, people are more inclined to go along with their friends and agree with the group, agree with their peers, than in places with small and weak families. And you get the same pattern for the church. So people are thinking about approaching the world differently, and you can pick it up in these kinds of experiments. If we take a public good, so we could do public goods games where we actually get an experiment and we measure people's willingness to cooperate with strangers, or we can take something like voluntary blood donations where you're donating blood anonymously to a stranger. They're never going to know who you are, but you're going to help them. People need blood and when they have injuries and whatnot. And we find out that places with greater kinship intensity are less inclined to make voluntary blood donations, less inclined. And you see similar patterns in these other places. Now, in terms of giving to kin or people they know, it's at least as strong. So this isn't a general prosociality thing. People in places with intensive kinship are super concerned and worried about their close group. It's just that they're not worried about the far group, the distant stranger. Okay, now we can show the same thing in Europe. So this is strictly European data. So what we see is greater cousin marriage in various parts of Europe during the 20th century. And we see more conformity in places with higher kinship intensity, more cousin marriage, less trust in that, less impersonal fairness, and less individualism. So we can see these patterns just by comparing provinces or regions within Europe. Okay, now there's also a growing body of data confirming this in other places. So combining work by the psychologist Thomas Talhelm and my student Graham Noblet, whose dissertation defense is in a couple of hours, they're able to link the paddy rice agriculture and agricultural risk, which explains the prevalence of large lineages in China. And then they're able to link those lineages to features of psychology. So analytic thinking, self-concept, individualistic self-concept, and in-group loyalty. So creating more of an in-group, out-group. So you see this in China. Thomas has similar data in India. So you seem to be able to see this pattern working itself out in Asia. The economist Augustin Bergeron, working in the Democratic Republic of Congo, sampling people in the city of Kananga, is able to make the following links. He links people based on their home villages to the proximity of those villages to historical Christian missions. So here the idea is the Christian missions plop down, say 1900. They affect the kinship in these villages. That leads to lower kinship intensity in villages close to missions. That can then be measured now in aspects of psychology. And he measured moral universalism and in-group loyalty. And then finally, some economists at the University of British Columbia, led by Munir Squires, looked in the US at the state laws that were imposed in the 19th century that lowered cousin marriage rates. And groups that had been having high cousin marriage end up with greater income and urbanization decades later. And this can be linked back to these cousin marriages that affect these particular groups. So again, we see the basic logic playing out in all over the world. So linking culture to these various kinds of institutions, I've tried to make this link here clear for you. Then we can ask about these intermediate links. So one link I'll just say a little bit about, it's one of my favorite links, is the link from culture, norms, and institutions to innovation. So I think the key idea here is what I call the collective brain. Now, a lot of folks, especially in my milieu, think that innovation is driven by geniuses. So you have the heroic genius who through their own, they're working in their basement or whatever, and they, come up with some brilliant idea. But when you look at the history of invention, that's not what you see. What you see is new ideas are recombinations of existing ideas that are often generated when people who wouldn't otherwise meet come together and begin swapping ideas, and new ideas are born from that. There's all kinds of complex ways in which this recombination can occur. But the key part of this is that innovation is generated by the fluid interaction of individuals who trust each other and are cognitively diverse, meaning they possess different kinds of information in their heads, which could potentially be recombined. There are lots of social factors which affect that. So bigger cities are more innovative than smaller cities, above and beyond the population size. So this is a clear pattern we see in lots of places. So it's as if people in bigger cities are smarter. It's because they're disproportionately likely to create an invention. Immigration. Professor Nunn and others have made important contributions to this, but it's clear that a lot of the innovation in the US is driven by immigrants, bringing new ideas in, mixing with the ideas in the existing native population, and generating new stuff. Anytime the US has curbed immigration, it's curbed innovation. Universities, of course, are places where you're supposed to bring knowledge together, recombine ideas. Anything that fosters that recombination is going to drive innovation. And of course, literacy and world languages allow people to take ideas from other places through reading. But then there's lots of psychological factors. Coming together with someone who has different ideas in their head doesn't do any good unless you trust them enough to share the ideas and then potentially build something together. Individualism, the need to stand out, appear to be the smartest person in the room, set yourself apart by creating new ideas is going to help. You can't be too constrained by conformity. That's going to inhibit the presentation of new ideas. Having a preference for novelty, being willing to break with tradition, being willing to say the old ways of doing things are not the best ways. All of these are going to facilitate innovation. And crucially, tolerance of differences. So willingness to look past ethnic, religious, linguistic, class, and gender differences, focusing on the cognitive diversity available in diverse minds that can potentially be used to create. So if places have divisions, religious, ethnic, otherwise, they're actually constraining it's as if they have fewer people, because not all the minds are potentially interactants. And you can actually calculate stuff that way. All right, thanks for listening.
Great. Thanks so much, Joe. That was super interesting and a great overview of your research agenda. Thanks so much. So before we turn it over to Xiaopei, I'll abuse my authority here and just ask you a few questions, which I think are, and I'll make sure I won't ask the same questions that have been raised in the chat, which Xiaopei will talk about. And then, so just one thing I wanted to ask, and this is maybe it'll give you a chance to elaborate a bit on some of the details, is the collective brain stuff at the very end. The key point of that is, well, connections make us smarter. So when people are connected, then they're going to build this collective brain. And as a society, you're going to be smarter because there's a transfer of information. But then the research in the first half was saying, well, actually breaking down kinship ties, at least in the long run, hundreds and hundreds of years later, make you better. And so those two might seem counterintuitive, because when you weaken kinship ties, that means you're severing certain relationships with extended kin. And so can you reconcile those two, or maybe fill in the gaps about what happens after kinship ties are weakened, and then how do you become economically successful?
Yeah, I mean, a key idea in the collective brain is that you got to bring together cognitively diverse minds. And one of the things that happens when people build connections with people that are either, physically close to them or relationally close, these kin ties and stuff, most of those people have exactly the same information in their heads. So you want people that are, sort of maximally far from you, more likely to have very different information in their heads. So by breaking those ties and forcing people out into the world to interact with people very different from themselves, and creating institutions that can make that happen, like universities, and lots of other institutions do that as well, scientific societies, you're bringing together those diverse minds. And so in another project, just working with US data, we look at last names in different US counties, and we're able to show the counties that have more diverse last names. You can think of the last name as a container of knowledge. People with different last names come from different places, have different occupations. And that seems to be related to greater patenting in the next decade in the US. And we try to do some kind of checks to see if that's really driving it. At least we have preliminary evidence to think that that's the case. So that's the idea, that you need this cognitive diversity. You threw in the word better, and I'm always careful not to be normative, right? So it depends what kind of society you want. Having a large family with lots of kin ties can make for an extremely satisfying life. It can lead to greater happiness. Can be the source of your social security. So for example, you'd never want to break people's families down unless you had impersonal institutions that could substitute. So if somebody gets unemployed or falls injured and they don't have a big family, then they have no way to support themselves. So you need unemployment insurance and other kinds of things to deal with, shocks, because that's one of the main things that kinship systems have done over human history, is provide the safety net for people.
Yeah. So that's super interesting. And I guess that raises another question, which is, if you don't have the institutions or the institutions that develop to help facilitate anonymous exchange, then is the breaking down of kinship ties good? And then also, like, if we think of your work about the history of Europe, what were these important institutions that were developed that facilitated anonymous exchange that could substitute, or if you could talk a bit about that.
Europe is instructive in this case, because it looks like, historians can argue about this, and we're still doing a lot of research to try to, test some of these ideas. But my read of the history is that, at least in parts of Europe, in the Carolingian Empire, for example, the church had teamed up with the Carolingians essentially to really tear down these kinship. So we see that as kind of a particularly strong place. So innovation, for example, in Europe is, higher at one side of the Carolingian border than the other side. Just to give you one example. So there was this early stuff that mattered a lot in Europe, but it still took centuries before we had anything that looked like the kinds of institutions, political institutions and economic institutions, that diffuse over the world. But by the beginning of the High Middle Ages, you have guilds, which are kind of like modern labor unions, and they're replacing the structures of the family. People are using those for mutual insurance. They become occupational guilds eventually. So that's a voluntary association. You have charter towns where you join as a citizen, and the town actually, gives you some rights and responsibilities. These towns begin writing charters, which, are the forerunners to things like the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights, things like that. Universities are a voluntary association. They start as either basically a labor union for students or a labor union for professors, kind of pushing back against various authorities by doing collective action among strangers. And monasteries actually play a big role. So there's a proliferation of monasteries. They begin to have the democratic election of abbots. And these groups are all competing for members, because if you're a clan or a tribe, you can't quit. But if you're in one monastery and you don't like the way the abbot's running things, you could either unelect him or join another monastery. And so there was this proliferation of new monasteries and creating that competition among these groups. But it still took centuries before anything emerged that seemed to fit with the emergent proto-weird psychology at the time. So there's this long process of psychological institutional coevolution.
Great. So I'll stop there, because I know there's a lot of questions in chat, and I'm sure Chope has accumulated a lot of questions. So Chope, if you want to turn on your camera, and I'll turn the floor over to you. If I have a long list of questions, so if we end early, I'll come back to my questions, but I'm sure lots of them will be in the chat anyway, so I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Nathan. And thank you so much to the Reader Institute for having me on this platform. And thank you, Joe, for your presentation. I do have a lot of questions. I must say we will not, unfortunately, be able to attend to all of them, but the relevant ones will be addressed later after the course. So I've tried to group some questions into some similar themes, and some of them I might call out individually. So the acronym WEIRD seems to be, point to some traits that are positively prized or construed. And I'd love to know your thoughts on, the value judgments being applied as weird being superior or better.
Yeah, so great question. Thanks for the opportunity to discuss that. So one of the things I've found, so if you read the book, you'll find that I'm very clear on this point. There's no normative judgment about these traits at all. In fact, the way I present them in the book is I often point out, so one subsection of chapter 2 is called Weird People Are Bad Friends. And that's about how something called the passenger's dilemma, where weird people don't help their friends in a context when they could. Another chapter is called Missing the Forest. Another subsection is called Missing the Forest. And that's meant to point out the pitfalls of too much analytic thinking. So one of the aspects of psychology that varies is analytic versus holistic thinking. And if you only think analytically, you often don't see the big picture and the interconnections among relationships. And of course, the end of the book is all about how cognitive diversity is what really drives innovation. And that's always going to include holistic thinkers, analytic thinkers, and lots of different other kind of variation. So the book is super clear. Now, I think people who are particularly weird tend to see the WEIRD acronym and the traits associated with it as positive, because in their society, those are positive. But something like conformity, if you call someone a conformist, is that good or bad? Well, I can show you lots of evidence from societies where that's good. You should be a conformist. Kids who are conformists are better, they're smarter, at least as judged locally by parents and stuff. It's only if you're a nonconformist that you think conformity is bad. So in some sense, if you think that trait list looks positive, then you're just really weird.
Thank you for that clarification. And maybe I'll move into another question that's kind of thinking along the same lines, or just expanding on some of those traits within WEIRD. Has there been any work done on the impact of culture on self-regulation?
Yes.
And is there any link between the two?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different lines of research that get at patience, self-regulation, these kinds of things. And there's lots of ways to move that around. One of the areas that I'm fascinated with is the role of ritual. So getting people to do regular religious devotions or other kinds of rituals, which force them to remain quiet, do something repetitively, seems to be associated with greater self-regulation later in life. So it's one of these cultural traits that is associated with greater self-regulation. Yeah, I mean, there's also, this isn't self-regulation exactly, but there does seem to be a growing body of evidence that the emphasis on hard work that you see in Protestantism that work is kind of seen as something that is central to your character and part of your self-defining identity. So if you're an individualist, you don't have a big family, you're not defined by these other kinds of groups, one of the things that define you is your personal characteristics. Well, being a hard worker or a diligent person became something of value, and that seems to cash out in things that look like greater patience or deferral of gratification or things like that. But it's important. Let me get back to your previous point. That
Sure.
If you're weird, you probably think being a hard worker is a good thing, and that's saying something nice. But if you've lived anywhere else in the world like I have, that is not a positive trait in a lot of places.
Yes, and maybe actually picking up on a question about these value judgments being placed. It's been said that individualism in the African context can be met with a lot of resistance. And so how does one navigate that resistance or that conversation?
Well, I mean, I don't have particular well-formed views on that, the details of that conversation. I do think that there's a big problem if you try to impose these formal institutions that are evolved for a particular psychology unmodified onto people who have different ways of, different social norms, different family institutions, different ways of thinking. You're not going to get a fit there. You need to develop some kind of cultural evolutionary process where you can have small modifications in ways that are going to foster greater material security and whatnot. Radical transformation is just going to cause problems.
Thank you for that, Joe. And I'll move on to, I have a number of questions looking at the link between sort of weird and economic prosperity. You mentioned, from the data that you presented, we saw that where there was stronger kinship, there was generally lower economic prosperity. Could that be reverse causality, where lower economic prosperity leads to stronger kinship?
Yeah, great question. So it can't be simple reverse causality. And the reason for that is that the date of the economic measures, the satellite illuminations, is well after the date at which we measure kinship, which is like about 1900. So we're measuring kinship at 1900, but we're measuring economic prosperity 2010 or something like that. So 110 years different. So there's no way lights in 2010 can cause kinship in 1900. However, you could tell some more complex story where you have some sort of third variable that's changing through time. So we still have concerns about causality. We think there's enough other evidence from other sources, some of which I pointed to, like the Ghosh evidence in the US, that tells the same story. So we have converging lines of evidence here.
Great, thank you. And I mean, we've addressed the sort of causality element. There's also the almost definition element, where when you started the presentation, there was also this, and within the book, there was this notion that the way that data or studies have been done has usually been within the weird context, because it was the children of the professors who were being used as subjects, etc. So there's a broader question here about, can we really take the Western understanding of prosperity as a general model? And is that not kind of falling into the same sort of category of looking at those data points through one lens?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that point. The effort of The Weirdest People in the World, it's completely a non-normative book. It doesn't recommend that this is a good way of life or something that anybody should seek out. For example, individualists have higher suicide rates. There's all kinds of psychiatric conditions associated with not having enough social connections, feelings of loneliness. The idea that this is positive or negative, that's a question for each person to answer on their own. I don't have an opinion about that. The Weirdest People in the World is trying to explain the pattern of variation that we see in the world in terms of psychology and also some of the economic outcomes. Whether those things are good are not something I deal with in The Weirdest People in the World. And I don't think there's any easy way to even answer that question.
Sure, it is quite, I think there's a lot of questions coming up around sort of the direction of what this data is presented. And we have a question about, could we think about, or have you done any work on maybe policy implications arising from the findings? Is it desirable to think about, any specific changes that we could implement to achieve economic growth or prosperity as we've seen it?
Well, yeah, so I'm not a policy guy, so I'm reluctant to make any policy recommendations. But certainly if you want to follow the trajectory that was followed over the second millennia in Europe, you would ban polygamy, for example. But one of the things that Nathan and I often discuss is that there are probably many roads to prosperity. And the assumption that the pathway that the West followed is the only pathway is almost surely wrong. Cultural evolution is extremely creative and often finds many different pathways to do things. And this is actually something analytic thinkers do. They tend to project unilineal models. And there's interesting research on this tendency to look for single lines. So if you're overly analytic thinker, you think, well, there's just one path. We got to figure out how to follow that path. There's probably many paths that we haven't yet seen.
Absolutely. And maybe speaking about looking forward, most African countries, groups would fall into the non-weird category. What are some non-weird traits that we think could drive towards economic prosperity that we've seen? So you've already mentioned one around sort of, certain possible policy elements, but what are some of these psychological traits or products, as you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that we could implement to see kind of the economic prosperity that we've seen in the weird elements?
Yeah, one thing that I think is a really important trait that I've mentioned a few times is this quality of holistic thinking. So much of Western science and Western and even Western law is built on the idea that you break things down into particles and assign properties. So what do economists do? They break everything down to individuals and they assign them preferences and beliefs. What do physicists do? They break it down to atoms and then subatomic particles and assign them charges and other properties. And what does the law do? Western law assigns individuals, it assigns them rights. So it's basically the same move reapplied to different domains. But if you're a holistic thinker, you think about relationships, and you could build laws and policies and stuff based upon relationships between individuals. And that's been done in lots of societies over time. The question is there some kind of new and creative way that I haven't completely thought of for which one could take a more holistic view to all these kinds of things and build a new way of doing things. Corporate ownership, for example, the West is all based on individual ownership, but what's wrong with group ownership, right? That could do interesting things.
Yes, absolutely. And, when we think about where we are in today's world, we are increasingly remote. This course is being taught in a remote fashion. And so the question is, could interaction through digital platforms or formats be a channel for diverse groups or groups in different geographies to exchange information and create that sort of trust that we saw that was facilitated in the weird context? So what are your thoughts on how current day dynamics are evolving things?
Yeah, that's the great promise, I think, of virtual ways of interacting and communicating, is that it holds the potential to really fertilize the collective brain, the kind of global collective brain, but also to bring that collective brain to all corners of the earth, or at least the places that have the internet currently. So that's a great thing. Now, we always face the problem of cooperation, right? So what's best for the individual is to take everyone else's good ideas, but not share their own. So you always have to be building that trust. And the question is can we, through these virtual forms, build the kind of trust that's going to overcome that free rider problem?
Thank you for that. And there's some reference to what is being seen in Asia. So if we think about the Asian path to prosperity and economic growth, and could we compare that to Africa? Is there anything that we can learn from Asia from an African perspective? Is there anything that we can learn from Asian cultural dynamics?
Well, potentially. I like to use, China and Japan. Both of them are actually examples of something I mentioned earlier, where there's a tendency to think about development as a line, from traveling along some line. But what's going on both in Japan and China are new recombinations. So even though Japan began dramatically importing Western institutions in the 1880s in Meiji Restoration, and then after they lost to the Americans, they got, basically almost an exact copy of American legal codes and whatnot. The society still operates very differently because it's, American and European formal institutions interacting with a different way of thinking, a Japanese way of thinking. And that creates output. So for example, Americans sue each other like crazy, but Japanese aren't litigious in the way that Americans are, even though the same laws are available and one could, they tend to prefer arbitration and more less antagonistic ways of resolving conflicts. And in China, there's clearly an importation of Western style families beginning in 1950. One-child policy eliminates cousins, so there's a transformation of the family there. But there's still this powerfully strong state, psychological differences. One of the things that I think that the way Chinese do business, I'm thinking of the work of Mike Morris here, and compared to Americans is Chinese like to build relationships. So their business partners are often their friends and sometimes worked into the family. So they're really building up and thickening relationships with business partners. Americans like to have business partners and then friends, two different groups. And it's almost like you're sullying your friendships if any kind of monetary transactions or other kinds of things comes in. And I think that might be one way in which the intuitions of folks in at least parts of Africa may connect with the approach of Chinese business folks in that they want these thick relationships with, business and personal relationships layered together, whereas the Americans, they want to purify the two kinds of relationships.
Thank you for that. And as we move into the relational dynamics, we have an interesting question here about wanting to explore whether there's explore more the data on or the relationship between mental health and the degree of kinship in groups.
Yeah, so some of the research that I discuss or at least mention in The Weirdest People in the World, well, one, I'll just mention the happiness research. So there's a clear evidence in the happiness literature that greater material prosperity is associated with more happiness. But there's also evidence from Alberta Alesina and Paolo Giuliano that having strong family ties is associated with happiness. So what's clearly best is to be in a prosperous society, but then have a big family. Because you get the best of both worlds. Then you get the material prosperity and you get the big family. So you get the two bumps. So that's one set of research. Then there's this other research on suicide and whatnot that seems to associate the feelings of isolation and loneliness. There's lots of research showing you got to have lots of ties and that can be prophylactic against suicide and depression and other kinds of things. So those are these trade-offs, right?
Absolutely, in a life of trade-offs. Thank you so much. I think at this point, I will hand back to Nathan just to introduce his questions and then pull us through some concluding remarks.
Great, thanks so much, Xiaopei. That was fantastic. And then, so I think we have 2 or 3 minutes. So I just want to, before we have concluding remarks from Stelios, Elias, Leonard, and myself, just ask a few more questions, which are just follow-ups, actually 2. And so one is about, you mentioned China and business relationships being different and perhaps more similar to individuals within Africa. So one question is, if you're thinking of 2 individuals, it could be individuals going into business, we could be thinking about FDI, or it could be NGOs and the government. Is there any evidence that being more similar in terms of culture or weird culture affects relationships between individuals? And then the reason that might be relevant is because there's been an increase in Chinese FDI within the African continent. And so that's something that people have talked a lot about. And how does that compare to FDI from other countries? So is there anything that your research can provide insights on? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
There's evidence coming from lots of parts of psychology and elsewhere suggesting that people really do feel more inclined to trust and interact with those that they have some cultural similarities to. And so the kind of thing, and so you're going to get more trade, you're going to get more exchange, you might get more idea swapping. You even see it on co-authorships, right? And so that probably extends to, I mean, we have some omnibus measures that allow us to look at cultural similarity either across a bunch of domains or within specific domains. I haven't looked at it specifically with regard to kinship, but in what I was describing before about the way people like to do business and overlap relationships to create multiple lines of connection, social business, whatnot. That's true in a lot of societies with more intensive kinship, and that's going to have a feeling of similarity that I think would promote easier business relationships, for example. So I think that's a good bet.
And then the last question, which kind of came to my mind, and I think a few of the comments in the chat allude to this, is what about thinking of things like natural resource depletion, climate change, and maybe even conflict? These are things which are relevant now. Do we think, how does weird psychology compare to other cultural traits? And is this, is there any evidence on the correlation between that and then those types of outcomes?
Well, I mean, I haven't, no, I don't have anything specifically on those kinds of outcomes. I mean, gets back to my, none of this is normative concern. Obviously, the Industrial Revolution led to the combustion engine, which led to a huge amount of climate change, which has put the Earth in this precarious slot. So that can't be good. So that's clearly an issue. Now, the question is, solving it would presumably be facilitated by a lot more innovation. So we should be doing whatever we can to generate innovations, which is why I emphasize the collective brain at the end. But the economic entrepreneurialism that can power an economy can also cause people to deplete resources and exploit resources that they don't have to pay for. Costs aren't always built in, so they can take care of air. For a long time, industrialists and entrepreneurs exploited the rivers and the air and all kinds of things that they should have been paying for. So that's clearly one implication of all this.
Yeah, and I guess one point at which made me one thing that you said that made me think of this is when you're talking about analytic versus holistic thinking. So it seems like with holistic thinking, you have to think about the relationships between things. What I do here has effects on the other side of the world.
Yeah.
And so,
so that's a perfect example. Even when we study little kids, so little kids from societies that emphasize analytic thinking, we'll just see a small number of relationships, say between plants and animals. And if you do it with children in a society where they're more holistically oriented and more relationally oriented, they'll point to all these more relationships between plants and animals, for example, or between humans and plants and animals. So there's just a tendency to see more connections in those kinds of things.
Yeah, that sounds like a great area of future research. Yeah, because like you said, economics is very bad at understanding externalities, which is how I affect my neighbor, because we break things down and focus on so that's great. So thank you so much. We're out of time, and so I really appreciate it. So thanks to Joseph Henrich and Shope Ogunrumbi. And so thank you both. And we'll ask for the Elias, Stelios, and Leonard to turn on their screens. We'll have a few last comments, and I'll start before turning it over to Stelios, and then Leonard. So I'm very thankful that I was able to participate and be part of this endeavor. I think it was a bit of an experiment, and because we really, it's one of the first times that something like this has been done. And I just wanted to say two things, I guess, which is just reflection, my own personal reflection. So I don't want to implicate any of the other instructors or guest lecturers. So one is, this course was about African economic history from the perspective of economists. And I think very quickly, there was a connection made to economic development today. I think this was on the part of the instructors and then the guest lecturers, but I think also all of the individuals who are participating and listening also had a number of questions. So very quickly, questions arose about the link between the slave trade, for example, and economic prosperity today, colonialism and economic prosperity today. I think this just highlights, or as I reflect on this course, the importance of history for understanding contemporary economic development. And I think this was very clearly emerged in this course, and a lot of individuals on both sides of the screen were making that connection. And so that's one thing that really struck to me. The other thing that really struck me was, which I really understood, but I think understand even more, is even more salient, is that we really have an imperfect understanding of the world. So if you sit back and think about all the amazing lectures we've had by the world's experts in different fields, we can think of many instances in which the opinions were conflicting, right? And so you have different views about, particularly when we think about, okay, what do we need to do now moving forward? So predicting the future to some extent and thinking about policies, but even in making connections with the past. And so there were some speakers that thought colonialism had benefits, and others thought that, oh, on the whole, it may have been less beneficial. And then also thinking about kinship, there were different views about kinship and particular psychological traits. So you can think of James Robinson's talk from yesterday compared to today. I think there's a lot of interesting different views in those two. So this is just to say that anytime you hear an expert on TV saying that they've got things solved, that I think one individual really has it figured out. And this is the exciting thing about research, not only research we're doing, but research that young scholars are doing, research that you're doing at home. And so I think that's really, really exciting. We know a little bit, we're gaining evidence. I think the field is becoming more and more quantitative, which is interesting. So you can move beyond just having different views from reading the secondary literature, and you can start digging into the data, understanding empirical relationships. I think that's exciting. But I think there's a lot that we don't know. And moving forward, that's important to understand. So I'll turn it over to Stelios.
Thank you, Nathan. And thank you, Joe and Sope. This was actually wonderful. I will just take a couple of minutes and I'll just build a bit on what Nathan just mentioned with a brief anecdote. So yesterday I was walking around campus with an undergraduate, and we were talking about basically the course. So he's actually watching it from his dorm, and he was very excited. And then he turns to me and says, look, I was talking to a colleague of yours. And, this actually undergraduate is very brilliant. Like, he works a lot. He wants actually to do a PhD in economics, and he wants to, he loves to understand development. And then he's telling me that, but look, this course your colleague is telling me that is neither macro nor micro. So it's not actually a standard way of doing economics. And if I want to be successful in getting into a PhD program, I should actually do something more, broadly accepted. So I either do micro or macro or labor or health. And, then I was stunned because I realized that actually, this type of course that we offered the last 10 weeks is really an interdisciplinary course. It's really like putting the barriers down and saying, we care about the answer to the question. We don't care about the tools. We'll actually use any tools that will allow us to get a better understanding why a certain region, a certain continent does better in some dimensions than another one. So that's actually, one thing that I would like you to take out of this course is that, whenever you see, different approaches, embrace them, bring them in. If we really want to understand development, underdevelopment, and its consequences and its origins, we cannot be homogeneous, right? We cannot do only a macro approach or micro or labor. We have to be holistic. We have to be interdisciplinary. So that was an interesting walk yesterday on campus here at Brown. So now a couple of more things. How can we stay connected? So we've been talking a lot with Nathan, Leonard, and Elias about this. And here are a couple of thoughts going forward. So given that we have created this great community, I think what we will be doing that periodically, we will be posting, tasks that, we can actually invite you to give your input. For example, now that we have this large pool of motivated students, we can post a job saying, we need help accessing a local archive in Lagos or in Nairobi, or digitizing a set of maps in a specific library in one of the capital cities, or other tasks that we would usually, outsource or allocate to research assistants locally. Now we have you, so now we can actually reach out to you. So this way we can start to know you better individually and be able to help you in your journey towards perhaps a PhD program, somewhere in the world. Also, we plan to be posting our working papers on the Wheeler course website, and leave it open for feedback. So we would love basically to hear from you, if whenever we are posting something new. Also, many of you have suggested that they would like to stay connected, not only with us, but also among yourselves. So at some point, we will ask you to see whether you're willing to share your contacts in order to join a group where people interested in these topics may exchange ideas and stay connected. Now, going forward, be entrepreneurial, improve your technical skills. So in the coming days, for example, Wheeler will alert you on an online GIS course that will take place sometime in May. So stay tuned. And there are also a ton of free, high-quality learning opportunities on the web to own your coding skills and econometrics and statistics background. So as Nathan mentioned, there is more and more work that is quantitative, no matter how you bring these insights from anthropology, from evolutionary biology, from economics, from social history, quantifying things is actually the token of the day. So learn Python. This way, when we post a task that we need a research assistant that is a bit more technical, you can actually help us with that. And then, this is how we can create a relationship. This is how we can, hopefully, bring some of you over and, kind of decolonize the literature. Now, in your spare time, read about your country's history or your continent's history. Ask the elderly in your place of residence of origin what aspect of local history is particularly salient. Contrast it with what actually you learned the last 10 weeks. Can you quantify it? Give it a shot. Is there some local archive you can access? Many of you are signed up from universities in the African continent. Go to the librarians in your local university. Ask them to show you books or editions that have interesting maps. Think out loud. Now, see how many times you saw Murdoch map that nicely Nathan digitized back in time and how much more research generated. There are many Nathans among you, but liberate them, so how you do that? Just search for material that is actually under the sun, but no one has looked at it so far. Last bit, if you have already started your PhD journey, keep writing, keep a note on you, fine-tune your thoughts, be your harshest critic. I look forward to reading your work. Leonard, you're coming next, I think.
Yeah, so I'm going to echo, thanks again. I'm going to echo what had been said earlier, which is that it was a great initiative and this was extremely successful as 3 levels. First, the attendance was really impressive. The multidisciplinarity, the range of topics covered, the range of methodology used, and also, even you look at the instructors, there is a wide range of interest, methodology, and background, which is really amazing. And also, I really appreciate the open-mindedness, the fact that there is no right and wrong way to do this. We just try to find out how what we are saying, what we are doing fit together. I think, and it's very refreshing, in a profession that had been criticized for being a little bit, less of what I just described, so and so on. So at that level, I think it's really great. And I hope that this model could be replicated in other subfields, in other fields as well, because, the same way, for instance, we got people, even who are not trained economists, who are not even academics, to try to get the core of economic history research and to do something with it and to contribute to the discussion is something that should be happening, in all fields, because I mean, if the knowledge is only generated by academics, probably, there will be so much missing. Okay, now the second point is just an invitation for African economists, African social scientists in particular, to embrace, African economic history. I mean, I was trained at Northwestern, where history is taken very seriously. In the morning, we teach you mathematics and statistics. In the evening, we teach you history. And you don't pass your history exam. You don't have your history paper. You are not going to move. So I have colleagues, for instance, who their first paper as an economic theorist was actually an economic history paper. I think it's something that very strong. And why this is important? It's important because, I mean, for many Africans at least, there are a lot of, two things. So first that African history has so much interest, globally, that's fantastic. It just shows how important for understanding the world African history really is. So that's great. But then for African in particular, it's a process of self-discovery. The reason why I'm personally so fascinated by history is that I'm always asking myself about my parents, about my grandparents, where they come from, what they do, why in the world, for instance, I grew up what I grew up and be what I am today. Why, have so many questions I'm asking. And it's not just about, it's about, thinking about these things and write them down. So I think it's really an encouragement for any African, whether you want to become an academic or not, when you want to become, regardless of what you want to do in the future, a strong interest in African history is something which I think is a must, because there's still so much to be learned. And also, as Nathan have said, and also Silo have said, your contribution, because I mean, we have a lot of big picture stuff that have been said, but then, we need to know in this particular place how this plays out, with faces, with individual, with faces, with some family archives, things that might call into question some of our assumptions or might add to what we have already learned. I think it's really, really important that, okay. And then, so what I'm also, before I end, what I'm suggesting, as everyone have said, let's manage to stay together and let's manage to remain connected and to help people who, young Africans in particular, to get into graduate school, because I think some places like Northwestern have done very well. Anytime you go to Northwestern, there is an African student studying a PhD there. This is not the case in most universities, even places that have very strong development program. So I think it's a loss for the profession. So we need to find a practical way to advocate for young Africans who want to study. Regardless of what we want to study, when we want to do RCT, we want to become history, whatever. We just need more bodies, more minds coming from Africa in the profession, whether in Africa or outside Africa. To finish, one way as well is to make sure that there is some institutional connection between African universities and research centers, the one in the West. And this is particularly important in history because, history is being more and more devalued in many, many African universities, which is crazy, So if the impulse to change this come from outside, from us in particular, I think that's for the better. Anyway, thanks again for the opportunity. It has been a fantastic 3 months, and I'm looking forward to the next step. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you, Leonard. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Stelios. So I'll just keep it brief. So the first thing I want to say is a big thanks to the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development team. For what you see, there is a lot of underlying work by an amazing and very powerful team. Tiago, Bushra, Madi, our great Executive Director, Amelia Whitelaw, and my co-director, Rajesh Chandi. This is also a course that our donors, Tony and Maureen Wheeler, founders of Lonely Planet, are very passionate about Africa. They have portrayed Africa in their work, and something that they also deeply care, and as a broader community, we all care. Another big thanks applies to the amazing teaching fellows team that they also asked me to pass their gratitude to all of you. Alex, Julian, Jay, Alfred, and Ibrahim, and Guy. They have been with you every Fridays. They have been doing a lot of underlying work, a lot of it that you cannot see. And of course, since Stelios, Leonard, Nathan, and I reached out to many colleagues, I couldn't even have time to count them, approximately 30 colleagues. And as Stelios pointed out, from anthropology, from political science, from history, many working in African universities, many working, in places all across the world, many of them that we have just this small connection to. They were all very keen to participate, and I think we all learned from their approach. And it's something that we are very deeply, deeply thankful to the bigger community that we set up. Leonard, perhaps you know better, there's like this quote, this proverb, it's attributed to Africa, although there's some controversy, that if you want to go far, you better go together with others. And when we designed this course, we really wanted to have a big team. And now we view all of you who are attending this course, who have emailed us a lot and reached out as part of this bigger team. So as Leonard, Stelios, and Nathan pointed out, reach out. We will be in touch as well. Feel free to continue emailing us. We are currently reflecting how to move forward. Leonard has been very kind to invite us in Nigeria, in Benin, and the other places where the African School of Economics is expanding. So we are currently, I'm currently arranging with my family, where exactly and when to come. So we really want post-COVID to be there on the ground and engage with you as much as possible. We will have also a questionnaire about the course, not about the academic content, asking for your sincere feedback. And there we will also pose some questions how you want to be in contact. As Stelios pointed out, there will be a more specialized kind of course on Python for geospatial data, but we plan doing more and more. And both as LBS and the Wheeler Institute, but also, as a team. And we want to engage you as much as possible. Let me stress finally what Stelios and Nathan stressed in the beginning. There is a lot to be learned. We don't know much. Knowledge is widespread, and we want to keep investing on that without having any myopia on the technique. Every technique is welcome. It could be an experiment. It could be history. It could be economic theory of any kind of sort. It could be just history or insights from game theory. We need, as Leonard pointed out, more and more people engaging that. We hope that in the next years, this initiative, will have more and more followers. And actually, the next course, let's say 10 years from now, this is how Stelios and I concluded a review we did for the Journal of Economic Literature, that the next review on African economic history should be written not from anyone whose face appears here, but perhaps from some colleagues of Leonard in the African School of Economics or elsewhere. Why not? So thank you all for being with us. Thank you all for your kind remarks. During this period, we also had to make changes. When we started designing this sometime in the fall, neither Nathan nor Stelios nor Noella nor I had any idea that we would have 28,000 people registering, more than 15,000 attending at least one session, and thousands of people having watched the material online. The material will stay online. We will also post all slides and some additional material. Feel free to keep reaching out. I like also this Lance, Leonard, Elias, Nathan, and Stelios suggestion. So thank you all, and we will be in touch. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Right. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
And just here you can see some follow-up events. We have a climate initiative tomorrow with the last session, and then Harvard University and Roland Pongu, part of the speakers that you saw. There's going to be an event at Harvard that you may want to attend in the weeks to come. Thank you all.